Maria Bennett stepped into the courthouse with a calm and steady pace, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floors. The room was full of the usual noise, lawyers discussing cases, people waiting for their turn in front of the judge. But Maria remained focused and composed, her heart steady with the practiced ease of someone who had walked into many such rooms before. She was tall, with a confident posture, her suit simple yet elegant, a soft gray dress paired with a blazer that spoke of sophistication, not flashiness. Maria wasn't one to flaunt her status, but it was there for anyone who looked closely. Her presence was enough to turn a few heads, but she wasn't concerned with that today. She had something more pressing on her mind. As she approached the wooden bench where Judge Charles Whittaker sat, his eyes met hers for a brief second before he looked back down at the case file in front of him. He was older than her by a good decade. His face was lined with the marks of experience, his hair mostly gray, but his demeanor was sharp, his robes crisp, as if freshly pressed. There was an air of authority around him that was undeniable to anyone in the room. But Maria wasn't intimidated. She had seen it all before, the men and women who thought they knew more simply because of their position, the ones who thought their authority gave them the right to judge people as if they were above them. She wasn't like the others who might have flinched in front of a judge like him. She held her ground. Judge Whittaker glanced at her again, his eyes narrowing just a fraction of a second before he spoke in a clipped tone. "That's Bennett," he said, and there was a brief pause, as if the name was unfamiliar to him. Maria nodded once in acknowledgement. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice calm, and even her eyes unwavering. He looked down at the paper in front of him, and then back at her, an eyebrow raising. He glanced again at the details of her case, a traffic citation, a speeding ticket, nothing too serious. But his expression shifted slightly. He was already making assumptions, the kind of assumptions people often made about others based on where they were, from how they looked, or what they wore, the kind of assumptions that came from a life spent in a place of privilege. The judge didn't waste time on pleasantries or small talk. He went straight into the proceedings, his voice firm and quick. "We can't have people speeding through our streets," he said without looking up from the paperwork, and as he read the details of her case, he seemed more focused on the mistake of speeding rather than the context behind it. Maria had explained on the form that she had been rushing to the hospital. Her daughter had been taken there after an accident, but Judge Whittaker didn't seem to care about the urgency or the reason. He just saw another person in front of him trying to get away with breaking the law. In his eyes, it was all about the rules and how they should be followed. No exceptions, no excuses. Maria felt a pang of frustration, but it didn't show on her face. She had learned long ago how to keep her emotions in check. She could feel the judge's gaze lingering on her, as if she were just another case, another statistic, another number in the system. But she wasn't just that. She wasn't just another person to be processed in the court. She was Maria Bennett, and she would not let him judge her based on assumptions. Maria could feel the tension building in the air as Judge Whittaker continued his examination of the case file. His eyes barely flickered up to meet hers again as he spoke with a tone that seemed detached, almost clinical in its delivery. There was no warmth, no understanding, just a professional coldness that told her he was more focused on the process than on the person standing in front of him. He read aloud the details of the violation, the time, the location, the speed, the usual facts that painted her as just another driver caught breaking the law. Nothing extraordinary, nothing remarkable about her. At least, that's how he saw it. Maria's heart clenched as she stood there in silence, feeling the weight of being treated as another faceless case number. And it wasn't the first time she'd felt that sting, the sting of being overlooked, of being underestimated simply because of the color of her skin or the expectations people had of her and her life. She shifted slightly as the judge looked over the papers and began speaking again, his voice more authoritative now. "Ans Bennett, you claim there was an emergency. But unless you can prove it, speeding is still speeding," he said, his words quick, his gaze cold. Maria opened her mouth to speak, but before she could finish her sentence, he raised a hand to silence her. He didn't want to hear more explanations. He didn't care about the details. He had already made his decision in his mind. Maria's mind raced for a moment as she stood there. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, the soft murmur of the onlookers who had gathered for their own cases. People who had their own reasons for being in the courtrooms, some with trivial matters, some with far more serious charges. She felt a wave of frustration, but she fought it back. She wasn't going to let herself become another example of someone who didn't matter. She had worked too hard for that. She took a deep breath and met Judge Whittaker's gaze directly with a calmness that belied the storm swirling inside her. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the tension. "I was rushing to the hospital to be with my daughter. She had been in an accident, and I had to get to her. I'm not making excuses. I'm explaining what happened." The judge didn't look up from his paperwork as he spoke, his voice still rigid and dismissive. "That may be so, but that's not a good enough reason to break the law," he said in a tone that seemed final, his words clipped as if he were already moving on to the next case. Maria bit the inside of her cheek, trying to keep her composure. She had known from the moment she walked into this room that there was a chance this wouldn't go in her favor, that her word wouldn't be enough, that the judge would look at her and see something that wasn't true, something based on assumptions, not facts, not the truth of her life, but still it hurt. She had spent years building a life where her achievements stood for themselves, where she could stand in a room and command respect not just for the work she did, but for the person she was. But in this moment, none of that mattered to the judge. None of it mattered to the system that seemed more concerned with enforcing rules than understanding the complexities of real life. As the judge continued to speak and outline her fine and the suspension of her driving privileges, Maria held her ground. She stood tall and silent as the words poured over her, words that felt like they were not just about speeding, but about something deeper, about how people like her were too often dismissed before they even had a chance to explain themselves, how her life and her struggles would always be seen through the lens of someone else's assumptions. Judge Whittaker's voice echoed in the courtroom as he finished delivering his ruling on Maria's case. He outlined the fine, a hefty amount that seemed disproportionate for a minor traffic infraction, and the suspension of her license, albeit temporary. As he spoke, his tone lacked any real empathy, almost as if the words were an automated response rather than a personal decision. Maria stood there, her expression unreadable, her back straight as if the weight of the moment was something she had long prepared for. When the judge finished, he looked at her for a moment longer, his eyes scanning her with a sort of finality. There was a brief silence in the courtroom before the gavel struck, sealing the judgment. The soft murmur of the audience swirled around her as she stepped forward to accept the decision. It was a familiar sting, one that echoed the countless times she'd felt misunderstood or unfairly judged. This time, though, it felt even more personal. As she moved to collect the necessary paperwork from the clerk's desk, Maria couldn't help but feel a deep, simmering frustration. It wasn't just the fine, though that in itself seemed ridiculous considering her explanation. It was the way he had dismissed her entirely, reduced her down to just another person in the system, another case to be handled without a second thought. She heard the judge speak again behind her, giving instructions to the next case, but his words felt distant, as if they were happening in another world. Maria held her breath for a moment, allowing herself to settle before she turned to leave. The coldness in the room followed her like a shadow, and as she walked towards the exit, she could feel the eyes of those around her, the soft whispers as she passed. It wasn't that she cared what they thought. It was just that, for a moment, she felt more like a statistic than a person. Maria's mind raced as she exited the courthouse. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hallway seemed to magnify the injustice she had just experienced. Her heart pounded, not with anger, but with a quiet, steady ache. She had been in these kinds of situations before, had felt the sting of being overlooked or judged unfairly because of her race, her gender, or some combination of both. This wasn't a new battle. It was just another reminder of the world's tendency to see her as less than. She reached the steps outside the courthouse and took a deep breath, inhaling the cool air as it brushed against her skin. The weight of the fine and the suspension settled on her shoulders, but she knew she couldn't let it define her. She was more than this moment, more than the assumptions made about her. Still, it hurt. It hurt deeply. She wasn't sure she had ever fully grown, used to being treated like she didn't matter, like her experiences were insignificant. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from her assistant. "All set for your 3 o'clock meeting, Ms. Bennett. Conference room 5. Maria's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. In that moment, she knew what she had to do. She had to keep going, keep pushing, keep proving that the world didn't get to define her. Not now. Not ever. The drive to her office was a blur, the streets familiar but distant. The quiet hum of the engine and the rhythm of the road provided a brief sense of calm, but the injustice of the courtroom followed her, the memory of the judge's indifferent words swirling her mind. By the time she reached her office, Maria had collected herself. She walked through the lobby, her heels clicking once again, each step purposeful and determined. There was a meeting to attend, and she would not let today's small defeat distract her from the greater victories she had yet to achieve. The next few days were a blur for Maria as she threw herself into her work. Meetings, strategy sessions, and conference calls filled her schedule, each one a small piece of the greater machine that she ran with precision. She had learned long ago that when the world outside seemed determined to pull her down, the only way forward was to keep climbing, to focus on what she could control. And at this moment, what she could control was the success of her company, her team, and her career. But the sting of the courtroom judgment still lingered in the back of her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a traffic violation to him. It had been a reminder of something larger. It wasn't just about speeding or an emergency. It was about how, no matter how successful or accomplished she became, some people would always see her through the lens of prejudice, of assumptions. Then came the unexpected message. It was an invitation to a corporate gala that her company was hosting. The gala would bring together executives from different industries, as well as influential figures from the legal and political worlds. Maria was accustomed to such events, but this one had a curious twist. Judge Charles Whittaker, the very man who had fined her, was listed among the attendees. She stared at the invitation for a moment, her fingers lingering on the edges of the email as a strange thought crossed her mind. What if this was an opportunity for something more? What if this was the moment to confront the judge, to speak about the bias she had experienced in his courtroom, to make him understand who she truly was? At first, Maria hesitated. She wasn't one to seek confrontation, especially with someone in a position of power. But the more she thought about it, the more the idea settled into her mind. She would go not for the sake of confrontation, but for the sake of clarity, both for herself and for him. There had been a moment in the courtroom, a brief second where she had seen the flicker of a thought in the judge's eyes, a shadow of something he hadn't fully processed. He might not have realized it, but that moment had left an impression on her. So she made up her mind. She would attend the gala, and when the time was right, she would speak with him. The night of the gala, Maria arrived dressed in an elegant black dress that shimmered subtly under the lights, her posture straight and confident. She was greeted by colleagues and clients as she moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries and shaking hands. Despite the glitz and glamour of the evening, Maria remained calm, her mind sharp and focused. She wasn't here for the accolades or the recognition. She was here to make her point, to address what had happened in that courtroom, and to do so on her terms. As she scanned the room, she saw Judge Whittaker across the hall, chatting with a few high-profile lawyers and executives. His demeanor was easy, as if he belonged in this world. As the moment came, Maria made her way toward him, her step steady, her presence commanding. The judge didn't notice her approach until she was only a few feet away, and when his eyes finally met hers, there was a brief flicker of recognition, a flash of surprise. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice polite but distant, as if unsure of how to proceed. "I didn't expect to see you here." Maria offered a smile, though it was anything but warm. "I thought this might be a good opportunity for us to talk," she said, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something deeper. "About our previous interaction." Judge Whittaker's face softened slightly, but there was an edge of defensiveness in his posture. He was a man who wasn't accustomed to being questioned, especially not in front of colleagues and peers. But Maria didn't back down. This was her moment, and she was going to use it to make a point, not just for herself, but for anyone else who had ever been made to feel less than because of who they were. As Maria stood there, facing Judge Whittaker, the energy between them was palpable. He shifted slightly, a hint of unease crossing his features, as if he hadn't anticipated this encounter. It wasn't just a professional interaction, it was something more personal, something deeper. Maria's gaze held steady, calm yet unyielding, as she took a moment before speaking again. "I wanted to speak with you about what happened in your courtroom," Maria said, her voice measured but firm. "About the way I was treated." The judge blinked, his posture stiffening. For a moment, he seemed unsure of how to respond. He was accustomed to being the one in control, to being the one who delivered judgments, not the one receiving them. But there was something in Maria's presence, something undeniable, that made him pause. The eyes of the room seemed to shift subtly, the air growing thicker as their conversation drew attention. "I don't quite understand," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "I thought we were following protocol. You were speeding, and there were consequences." Maria didn't flinch. "It's not about the speeding," she said, her words deliberate. "It's about the way you dismissed me before you even heard my story. You didn't ask, you didn't listen. You didn't consider the reason I was in that car rushing to the hospital to be with my daughter." Judge Whittaker looked at her, searching her face as though trying to decipher something he hadn't fully grasped in their earlier encounter. He cleared his throat, his voice less authoritative now, more thoughtful. "I'm sorry if it seemed that way," he said slowly. "But the law—" "I know about the law," Maria interjected, her tone still calm, though with a firmness that made him pause. "I've built a career around understanding rules, systems, and procedures. But I also know that being human, understanding context, and considering the bigger picture, that's just as important. In that courtroom, I wasn't just another case to process. I was a person with a real life, with real struggles. And you overlooked that." There was silence for a moment, and Maria could sense that Judge Whittaker was struggling to come to terms with her words. He had spent his career upholding the law, enforcing its rules, believing that order and fairness came from strict adherence to the system. But now, standing before her, he felt the weight of something more, something that transcended the letters of the law. Judge Whittaker began, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say. In truth, he had never really thought about it this way. He had followed the process as he always did, treating everyone the same, assuming that fairness was inherent in the system. But now he was being faced with the reality that maybe, just maybe, the system was flawed. Maybe his assumptions about people had been colored by biases he hadn't even realized were there. Maria let the silence linger, giving him space to reflect on what she had said. She wasn't here to accuse him, to attack him. She was here to make him understand, to help him see what she saw. "I don't need an apology," she said finally, her voice soft but filled with quiet conviction. "What I need is for you to understand that people are not their offenses. We're not defined by our mistakes, by the way we're perceived at first glance. I don't want you to treat me as just another person in your courtroom. I want you to see me for who I really am." Judge Whittaker nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful, his mind clearly racing as he processed her words. For the first time, he saw her not as a defendant or a case to be decided, but as a human being with a story and a life that went far beyond that brief encounter in his courtroom. "I'll try," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I'll try to see people differently. Thank you for making me realize that." Maria gave a small nod, acknowledging his words. It wasn't a perfect resolution. It wasn't an instant transformation, but it was a start. And for her, that was enough. As she turned to walk away, she could feel the weight of the conversation settle in her chest, a small victory in a larger battle. The rest of the gala passed in a blur for Maria. She moved through the crowd with a quiet resolve, her mind still processing the conversation she had just had with Judge Whittaker. She could feel the shift, a subtle change in the air, and while she knew it wasn't a dramatic breakthrough, it was something. A seed had been planted. He had heard her, and for the first time in a long while, she felt that her voice had mattered. As the night wore on, she found herself reflecting on how much of her life had been shaped by these moments of being overlooked or underestimated. From her early days in a career dominated by men, to navigating a world that often tried to tell her that her success was a fluke, to this, standing face to face with a judge who, despite his authority, had been blind to the deeper truths of her life. Maria had spent so much of her life pushing back against these moments, using her strength and intelligence to rise above them. But what if, just maybe, the change didn't always have to come from fighting? What if sometimes it came from helping others see things differently? She glanced around the room, watching the influential figures laugh and talk, networking and making connections. In many ways, they were all just playing their roles. Executives and politicians looking out for their own, climbing higher, moving ahead. But Maria wasn't just there to play a part. She had learned to thrive in spaces where she was often one of the few. It was never easy, but it had taught her the power of persistence and the quiet strength that comes with being underestimated. People saw what they wanted to see, and she had learned to let them. It gave her room to maneuver, to shift the narrative in her favor. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. The text was from her assistant. "Ms. Bennett, your 9 a.m. with the board is confirmed. Please don't forget the presentation." Maria smiled faintly. It wasn't just the presentation she had to focus on. It was everything. The judge, the fine, the perception. It was all part of a much larger picture. She had worked her way to the top of her industry for a reason. Not just because of her intellect and talent, but because she understood people. She understood the subtleties of influence and persuasion. She had learned that the rules of the game didn't always have to be played by the book. Sometimes you had to rewrite the rules yourself. As the night drew to a close, Maria made her way to the exit, her steps steady, her mind clear. The brief interaction with the judge had set a spark, but there was still so much work to do. There would always be people who didn't see her for who she truly was, who would make snap judgments based on the surface. But Maria had learned that she could do something about it. She could control the narrative, shape the way others saw her. When she stepped out into the cool night air, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. There was no grand resolution, no instant change, but she had started something. And that for now was enough. The following morning, Maria stood in front of the board, her presentation in hand. Her team sat in the room, watching her intently as she outlined her vision for the company's future. As she spoke, she could feel the power of her words, the weight of her experience. She was no longer just the woman who had been dismissed in that courtroom. She was the woman who had turned her own story into something powerful, something undeniable. She had learned, through moments like the one with Judge Whittaker, that her strength wasn't just in the achievements she could point to. It was in the way she moved through the world, how she chose to define herself. And as the board members nodded in approval, Maria knew she was on the path to something greater. She wasn't just going to change perceptions, she was going to shape the future. Days turned into weeks, and Maria continued to navigate the demands of her work and the shifting dynamics of the people around her. She had returned to her regular routine, but the conversation with Judge Whittaker had lingered in her mind like a quiet whisper that refused to fade. It wasn't just about the judge anymore. It was about the larger system, the subtle prejudices, the assumptions, the moments when people like her were judged not for their actions, but for who they were. The impact of that night, of standing up for herself in front of the judge, was still unfolding. In the weeks following, Maria had been invited to speak at several high-profile panels on diversity and leadership. Her story of breaking barriers and navigating systemic challenges in her industry resonated with many. It felt good to be recognized for her achievements. But more than that, it felt like a moment of validation. Maria had worked tirelessly to earn her place, but hearing her story echoed in the voices of others made her realize something important. She wasn't alone. One morning, as she sat at her desk, reviewing some figures for an upcoming merger, her phone rang. It was an unknown number, but something about it caught her attention. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello," she said, her voice calm but alert. "Ms. Bennett." The voice on the other end was tentative, almost apologetic. "This is Judge Whittaker." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected to hear from him. "Judge Whittaker," she replied, her tone neutral. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to reach out to you," he continued, "to thank you for our conversation at the gala. It's been on my mind ever since, and I wanted to say that I've given it a lot of thought." Maria leaned back in her chair, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. It wasn't often that someone in his position admitted to reassessing their views, especially not publicly. I appreciate you taking the time to reach out, she said, choosing her words carefully. I know our conversation wasn't easy, but I'm glad you listened. I've been reflecting on what you said, Judge Whittaker continued, and I realize now that I've been blind to the deeper realities that people like you face. It's easy to become so entrenched in the rules that you forget about the people behind the cases. Maria was quiet for a moment, absorbing his words. She wasn't sure what to make of his apology, but it was a start. I think, she said slowly, sometimes it takes a moment of discomfort to see things differently, and I'm glad you were willing to see things from a new perspective. There was a pause on the other end of the line before the judge spoke again. I'm not sure what kind of impact I can have, but I want to make sure that when I sit on the bench again, I don't make the same mistake. I've been in this profession for years, but I've never really thought about the way my decisions can affect someone on a personal level. Maria smiled faintly. It wasn't the apology she might have expected, nor was it some grand gesture, but it was enough. That's all anyone can ask for, she said softly. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with moments like this. They exchanged a few more words before the conversation ended, and as Maria hung up the phone, she felt a quiet sense of closure. She hadn't expected this kind of resolution, nor had she sought it, but sometimes change came in unexpected ways. The judge's words were a sign that perhaps, even in the world of law and order, there was room for growth, for understanding, and for the kind of transformation that began with listening. As she turned back to the reports on her desk, Maria felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had fought for her place, not just in her career, but in the world, and she had made a difference. The road wasn't always clear, but with each step she took, she was reshaping the path for others to follow. The following months were a testament to Maria's growth, not just as an individual, but as a leader. Her company's stock soared as she successfully led the merger, and her reputation continued to spread across industries. Maria had always been the type of person who thrived under pressure, but now she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment that she had never quite experienced before. The journey of battling personal and professional biases had given her an even greater sense of purpose. Her work with the company was demanding, but Maria knew that her influence extended beyond the boardrooms and corporate strategies. Her voice was now recognized at every level, whether in industry events, panels, or conferences focused on leadership and diversity. Maria had become a beacon for those who, like her, had to navigate a world that too often overlooked them. One afternoon, as she sat at her desk reviewing a proposal for a new initiative, a familiar name popped up in her inbox, Judge Whittaker. She hadn't heard from him since their last conversation, but his message piqued her interest. *** subject. A moment of reflection and gratitude ***. Maria clicked on the email, and as she read, she felt a mixture of emotions. The judge had followed through on his promise. He had made significant strides toward understanding and was now leading initiatives to improve how the legal system interacted with marginalized communities. His email outlined the changes he had begun pushing for within the court system and how he was now focused on training other judges on the importance of empathy, context, and understanding the human side of the law. I wanted to personally thank you once again, he had written, for opening my eyes. I've been working with others to create a more inclusive legal environment, one that doesn't just apply the letter of the law, but considers the nuances of each case and the people behind them. Your words have had a profound impact, and I'm committed to ensuring that the kind of injustice you experience never happens again under my watch. Maria sat back, reflecting on the long, unexpected path that had led her here. It had all started with a small, seemingly insignificant incident, a traffic violation that turned into something much larger. She had never anticipated that one conversation would trigger such a ripple effect. But there it was. The system, with all its complexities and flaws, had begun to shift. She hadn't just changed one judge's perspective. She had made him rethink an entire approach to justice, and through him, countless others would be affected. The realization made her smile. There was a power in speaking up and standing firm even when the world tried to silence you. Maria had learned that sometimes the quietest moments held the most power. It wasn't always about the loudest battle, the most aggressive fight. Sometimes it was about planting seeds and trusting that, in time, they would grow into something bigger than you could ever imagine. Later that week, Maria was asked to speak at a national conference on leadership and diversity. She shared her story about the traffic violation, the conversation with Judge Whittaker, and the lessons she had learned along the way. She spoke not just about the professional accomplishments she had achieved, but about the personal journey, about the quiet revolutions that had occurred within her own heart. As the applause echoed in the conference hall, Maria felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had done more than succeed in business. She had made a difference. And as the lights of the stage dimmed, she knew that this was just the beginning. The world was changing, one conversation, one action, one moment at a time. And Maria Bennett was right there at the forefront, leading the way.